Hello and welcome to this week's myNewsWrap, news from the world of SAP, Microsoft and the world in between. Let's get started with the SAP side of the house. There I have basically two news. Unfortunately, nothing around Kyma, but maybe there might be some news about Kyma in the near future. So let's get started what's already out there in the SAP world, and there is now the version 2.0 of the SAP Cloud SDK available for JavaScript. That was announced in beta a few weeks ago, and now the final version is out there. There are some changes in there. The blog post basically describes what are the major changes, that they did within this release. And there is also an upgrade guide referenced within the blog post. So if you are planning the upgrades, then make sure that you have a look at that upgrade guide, because if I remember correctly, there are some changes that might break something. And then there is another blog post that is quite interesting by a very well-known member of the SAP community, namely Marius Obert, who is now developer advocate at Twilio. And there is the first blog post, or it's not the first blog post, but I think the first technical blog post by him around how to send and receive SMS using Twilio as a service with the SAP Cloud Application Programming Model. And that's really interesting. So it's enhancing using the SAP Cloud Application Programming Model and hooking in the options that you have with Twilio in order to do the SMS handling. That's really cool. That's really nice. And I hope to see more in that area because I think that's where things go. Bringing together the best of all worlds, combining them and adding value there. So highly appreciated. Very nice blog post. Now with that, we're already through with the purely SAP news that crossed my path. So let's switch to the Microsoft side of the house. Let's start with a super cool blog post by Will Veleda around implementing feature flags in Azure Functions by using the Azure Service Azure App configuration. So the Azure App configuration allows you to define feature flags amongst other features that are in there in this service. And this blog post shows you how to set that up and then how to consume the service, namely the feature flag feature of Azure App configuration within Azure Functions. And that, of course, comes with all the goodies that come along when using feature flags in production. So that's really cool. To be honest, I didn't really, actively know about Azure App configuration. But that's definitely something to take a closer look at because that's super valuable in productive use cases. Then another blog post around Azure Functions by Aaron Powell about his Open API extension that he wrote for JavaScript Azure Functions. So as you might know, there is the support for .NET Azure Functions to create or to generate Open API definitions within Visual Studio. And there is nothing around the other languages that are supported with for Azure Functions. And now with this contribution by Aaron Powell, that is, I think, already quite some month old, you can now also generate or create Open API definitions for JavaScript and TypeScript functions. So you basically have to install the npm package and then adjust your function in order to expose the Swagger or Open API definition. There are several versions supported, so take a closer look at that package. I think quite useful for that kind of functionality. Then Azure Functions University is also starting again this year. I think it's the first session, if I'm not completely wrong, from the Azure Functions University this year. And it's about consuming or calling third-party REST APIs using Refit, which is a purely .NET topic. The video is already out there, so if you want to consume that, if you want to take a look at that, I have also referenced the link to the YouTube video. Of course, all the information is also available in the Azure Function University GitHub repository. Yeah, with that, some announcements around Azure Functions. So first, an official public preview. The Azure Tables extension for Azure Functions got a new public preview version that is available as a NuGet package, which connects to Cosmos DB Tables APIs, and that's, I think, the most important point, is now able to connect to storage tables using identity-based connections. So that's something that is continuously rolling out throughout the Azure Functions universe, so to say, to allow this identity-based connections for all the bindings that are out there. There are some other additions for .NET customers in order to be able to bind to types from Azure Data Tables and to use tables alongside the v5 storage extension, which is generic functionality. As usual, that's a public preview, so it's not yet, if you're not using .NET functions, you usually install these extensions via the extension bundle mechanism. Of course, as this is a preview, you cannot do that. That's not part of the extension bundle mechanism. So what you have to do is you really have to manually install the NuGet package that is referenced within the public preview blog post. And then, as we already had this identity-based connection topic, there is also a pull request on the Azure Functions durable extension that adds this functionality, so the identity-based connection support for the Azure Web Storage in the Azure Durable Functions extension. The pull request is merged, so it's part of the repository, but it's not yet part of the new version that will come out soon. So that will then be the version 2.7.0 of the Durable Functions extension. Yeah, with that, I'm at the end for the serverless part. So let's switch to the other side, to the container side. First, a little announcement. If you're using K3D, the GitHub repository of K3D is moving towards the K3D IO organization in order to make it completely crystal clear that K3D is a community-owned project. I have referenced the kind of tweet that announced that, and also the official, or the new official GitHub repository, which is now located under K3D-IO and K3D. The rest remains the same. Then one announcement around AKS, Azure Kubernetes Service, pardon me, which now supports in a public preview the version 1.23. So if you want to have a sneak peek and an early look at how that works with AKS, then this public preview is something for you. If you are not yet sure, or if you do not know what's coming with version 1, or what came with version 1.23, look at my last myNewsWrap session, because there I referenced the Rosenheim Azure meetup, where the folks from White Duck presented all the news around version 1.23. Super valuable. So if you do not know that yet, then look at that one. And if you want to try it out on AKS, here you go. It's available with public preview. Then when working with Kubernetes, you might spend some time with debugging. And there is a very nice blog post around debugging namespace deletion issues in Kubernetes, which can be quite some fun, to be honest. And this blog post gives you some hints how to get started and how hopefully to resolve those issues when you run into them. And in the same context, there is a tweet thread that I've referenced within the show notes around the top 8 commands by Daniel Bryant around debugging applications running on Kubernetes. So that's also quite nice to see. So what are kind of the first 3 steps that Daniel uses in order to get his hands on debugging applications, especially if they have issues on Kubernetes. And that's really cool. Some links that give you a bit more information are also referenced within this tweet thread. So hopefully some stuff that helps you. Then some announcements around the ecosystem of Kubernetes. One is that Chaos Mesh moves to the CNCF incubator status. So it's then basically under the umbrella of CNCF. What is Chaos Mesh? Chaos Mesh is a chaos engineering platform that allows you to execute chaos experiments in Kubernetes. So in order to make sure that Kubernetes is really resilient, introducing all the fun stuff around chaos engineering. And that's quite good news that that's also now under the CNCF umbrella, or started to run under the CNCF umbrella. And then kind of a highlight, I think, for me, from the area of KEDA. And there is an introduction of a new autoscaler called PredictCube, which is an AI-based predictive autoscaler made by Dysnix. So I don't know Dysnix, to be honest, but this blog post that I referenced guides you through what this scaler can do for you. And that's really interesting because all the other scalars are kind of basically, it's an if statement, right? So if the load is, or if the message payload is across some boundary, then scale up. And if it's below with some grace period, scale it down. That's basically it. And this scaler now goes into a different direction because it uses AI, or to be precise, it uses time series predictions. So it takes the data, and according to the blog posts, around 2 weeks of data are sufficient in order to train the AI model. And then it uses that AI model in order to do the autoscaling. So that's really, really interesting. It uses under the hood for the metrics Prometheus. So basically you can use anything for that scaling. So that's really interesting. And I'm surprised that due to the hype around AI, nobody was doing that before. But that's I think really a cool move for scaling Kubernetes workloads. With that, let's switch to Azure Container Apps. There are also some news around those. First of all, some, I think, quite useful thingy. If you want to get in touch with folks around Azure Container Apps, there is now a new channel, and that's the Discord channel. And that's referenced from the Azure Container Apps GitHub repository. I have put the link within the show notes. So if you want to get in touch with people there, then make sure that you are on the Discord channel. And then another thing that was not so super well received was an announcement that the namespace migration takes place for the APIs to provision Azure Container Apps. So there is a change from Microsoft.web to Microsoft.app. Now, what does that mean? For the portal, nothing changes, of course. For Azure CLI, you have to make sure that in March 2022, I think it's really at the beginning or in the early March of 2022, you have to install the new Azure CLI extension for container apps. If you're using ARM templates or Bicep, then you really have to do something, because, and that's also described within this announcement issue on the GitHub repository, you have to update the API version and you have to update the endpoints for container apps for kube environment, and the property kube environment ID has to be switched to managed environment ID. That's something that was not super well received by everybody. So there is also a tweet that I have a reference in the show notes that says that's not the coolest move that they made. And yeah, it's something that you now have to think about. I mean, that's kind of also a bit of the downside of the beta that is quite running now since quite some time. And then in the same context, there is a nice blog post also by Wilhelmina, so second blog post on this show, around creating and provisioning Azure Container Apps with Bicep. So that's quite basic in the best of all senses. Walk through how to deploy Azure Container Apps making use of Azure Bicep. Now be aware, and that's also referenced within the blog post, there is the old API that is referenced in there. So if you take a look at the blog post, you will see when coming to the Azure Container App specifics that the endpoints that are referenced are Microsoft.web. So those are exactly the ones that have to be switched then in March to Microsoft.app with all the other things that have to be changed. Nevertheless, if you want to get started, if you want to professionally deploy container apps, namely via Bicep, this blog post gives you a great starting point. And then another fascinating proof of concept around Azure Container Apps is using Azure Container Apps and Keda for autoscaling to create self-hosted scalable DevOps agents, so runners within your Azure DevOps environment, and deploying them using Azure DevOps and Azure CLI. So by Thomas Thornton, really super interesting post from my perspective. However, there is one glitch that is also referenced in there, that there might be some issues in conjunction with Keda, because the agents that you deploy might be removed at any point in time, depending on how the scaling is defined. So that's something that you have to keep in mind. Nevertheless, super decent blog post. And with that, we are already in the world of DevOps. So let's take a look what's new in the area of GitHub this week. There is one new feature around wiki pages. You can now upload images to wiki pages, as you could already do for issues, for example. So just drag and drop them and they are there. Then another, from my perspective, great feature that they added is you can now include diagrams in your Markdown files via Mermaid. So Mermaid allows you to define diagrams in a JavaScript style, so kind of Markdown-ish, which is now correctly rendered with GitHub, on GitHub pages, and on anything around GitHub. So that's really cool. Then some new features or some information from GitHub is around code scanning. So they are now introducing also machine learning features in order to make code scanning better, to improve it with respect to vulnerabilities. And the blog post that I've referenced within the show notes kind of walks you through why GitHub decided to do that, how they are doing that, and especially how you can benefit from that. So currently, this experimental feature is available for JavaScript and TypeScript analysis, and it's part of two analysis suites, namely Security Extended and Security and Quality. So if you are using those ones, then you might already benefit from this experimental feature. And then another blog post from GitHub, this time around GitHub Stars. So if you are on Twitter, you might have seen that the GitHub Stars renewal cycle started. So there are now the new and old and new GitHub Stars again nominated. And the blog post GitHub Stars in Our Eyes that I've referenced within my show notes now presents you some members of this round of this GitHub Stars community and what they do. And really interesting to see all the different and diverse people that are part of this great community. So definitely worth reading. With that, let's switch to the world in between SAP and Microsoft. And of course, as every Saturday, we have the SAP on Azure video podcast with a new edition. And this time, a bit more developer focused. The one with SAP Fiori, Azure App Gateway, and Azure Active Directory. So how can you combine those things in order to have internet-facing SAP Fiori applications? Quite lengthy one this time. So it's around 1 hour and 17 minutes. So there is quite some stuff to talk about. But I think very, very interesting and very valuable if you have this scenario, and probably most of the customers using Fiori have that. Then another blog post from the SAP community around bringing together best of both worlds, namely the CI/CD pipeline functionalities from SAP BTP and from Azure DevOps. So that's really great to see that those two worlds get combined more and more, and the value is seen that those stuff should be combined together. And this blog post guides you through the the configuration that you have to do in order to combine those two worlds in a reasonable fashion. And then just to remind you a bit, I have highlighted the blog post series about SAP and Microsoft Teams integration some time ago. And this is now picking up speed. So there are now five posts out, 5 of 9, around the combination of those two worlds, focusing on an HR scenario and integrating success factors, which is, from my perspective, a very natural scenario. And then, last but not least from this series, a new edition or a new episode of the blog post series by Martin Rappler around principal propagation in multi-cloud solutions. This time it's not a blog post, it's more a book. So it's more than at least estimated 30 minutes of read. It's a super extensive blog post, and it's built upon the other ones. So it's really the 5th part that details out now the area of introducing API management and introducing infrastructure management, namely monitoring, and also really combining all the worlds, also making use of Azure Arc. So that's really definitely worth reading. As usual, super high quality by Martin. Now, let's see what's to say about learning and events. And there I only have one highlight, but a super valuable one, namely a new video by Golo Roden around test-driven development. And with a little, catchy title, namely, why is TDD overrated? And this is really an interesting video, definitely well spent 20 minutes, as usual with Golo, but I really like that one also very, very much. And that's all. No new events that crossed my path, to be honest. So let's go to the developer experience section. And there is, one new blog post that's of interest for you if you're using Windows 11 or if you have already the honor to use Windows 11 on your working laptop, which I do not have. Nevertheless, there are some cool announcements around Windows 11 that are coming out. So there is now the Amazon App Store preview. I'm not sure why it's just Amazon, but it is what it is, within the Microsoft Store. And there are some enhancements around the taskbar that are really cool. And I like the one that you can now share any app that you have open, or a PowerPoint whatsoever, within Teams by just clicking on the icon in the taskbar. So that's, I think, super valuable. And there is also an update around Notepad, funnily, so oldie but goldie. And there, are more innovations coming up. There is even more in there, but I think those are really the highlights for me. And then last blog post that I'd like to reference for today is a blog post, unfortunately available only in German language, around hybrid work at Microsoft Germany. So some testimonials from employees of Microsoft Germany telling their experience with hybrid work. And also there are some links within the blog post that give you some more information or give you some tips and tricks, for example, around accessibility. Again, something I think worth reading, especially in today's world where hybrid work is the normal from my perspective. Now, with that, I'm at the end of today's session, and I hope I had some interesting news for you, some stuff to catch up with, some stuff to take a closer look at. And with that, I wish you a nice Saturday, a great Sunday, super successful next week, and we will see again next Saturday. Until then, bye.